Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? This is at the heart of what Mary Shelley was writing. It's a reflection from Paradise Lost. Ultimately, Frankenstein at its heart is the story of culture. And so we'll talk a lot about the monsters or the creatures' experience with culture. What did it look like? And companionship. And so this is about relationships at its core. And ultimately, the relationship that it's talking about is how should the Creator treat his creation? And so this is something that can be very personal to us, because if we've given any thought or time to our Father in heaven and considered what are his thoughts towards us, how do we relate to him as sons in his house? What does that experience mean? What is the value of it? And so we'll see here at the heart of this story is about a man, Victor Frankenstein, who creates what many will call the creature or the monster. And we'll explore kind of the dynamics of the relationship that takes place there and how each person is affected by the other. And ultimately, one thing that we're going to do today or this week, and I really want you to focus on answering this question, will be to ask, what is it that I need in my life? What are the things that I absolutely need? And so as we're going to read the first four letters in the book, and you'll see what those are as you open up your books to read, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around this particular topic. What do I think that I need? Now, let's make a real clear distinction here. I'm asking what it is that you think you need, not what it is that you want. And those are two distinctly different things, right? Wants are desires, things that I would like to have. Needs are like, in order to live, this has to happen. This is like, really what we're getting at is what is the core of life or living? What is the purpose of it? And again, let's really flesh this out, reflect on it. And I would, again, invite you into this kind of conversation with your parents or your siblings. And give some room for that to be separate and apart even from the book. I think if we ask this question first as we go into it, it will help us put a specific mindset moving forward on kind of where we're going to land in terms of one, what Mary Shelley was trying to communicate, because that was a very particular thing. And number two, for us to try to discern what does the Father want for us to get out of this, because again, this book is not written to a Christian audience. It's not written for the purpose of spiritual insight or wisdom. It actually is born out of a writing challenge that took place between Mary Shelley, her husband, Percy Blythe Shelley, and Lord Byron, some of whom were pretty significant writers of the time. And we'll get into that. And in fact, some of the videos that you'll watch this week will highlight how that happened over the year that they called the year with no summer. And that was due to a volcanic explosion on the opposite side of the world that caused the next summer to be blackened out by and large. And so it was the perfect setting for what they would determine to be a horror book. Now, we probably don't see it that way because we are, again, in our culture, inundated with much scarier images. But for the time, this was pretty revolutionary as far as like the shock value. It is a ghost story in many ways. Now, again, let's not get that confused with how we perceive that. Because as we even talked about how the image of, a really tall, flat-headed green monster with bolts in his neck is something that is cultural. It is certainly not what we find in the book. And so as we explore the book, let's do our very, very best to come at it with an open mind and an open heart and not assume that we know anything and taking it really at face value as we go through. And so a couple of things, and we'll get to this quote in just a minute. Let's talk about genre. What does genre mean? You guys, I know you've discussed this before. What is genre?
It's like a category.
Yeah. So let's categorize specifically how the author would have lumped this in. Now, again, we are reading Frankenstein, or she called it the modern Prometheus. Now, the interesting thing is, right, we just got through reading Prometheus Bound, right? Her husband, who was a poet, Percy Blythe Shelley, wrote Prometheus Unbound. They were heavily influenced by Prometheus Bound and some of those writings. So there's going to be a couple of different poems that I'm going to encourage you guys to listen to. One is pretty lengthy, but it's I think really well done by Sir Ian McKellen, Gandalf, for those of you who don't know, who reads it out. But it's called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. How many of you have ever heard the saying that somebody who was having difficulty, it was like they had an albatross tied around their neck? A little bit too old in the room. Anyways, that was popular in the English lexicon as meaning to deal with a hardship. That comes directly from this poem about a man who kills an albatross just for sport, and then he actually ties it around his neck, and then he feels the weight of it. And it's in many ways it mimics the story of Jonah in that the ship comes into trouble because of what the man did. But it's a poem that influences in part what we're going to talk about in Frankenstein. And so I think it's some like 26-minute poetry reading. But I want to encourage you guys to listen into that. And then the second one is called Mont Blanc, which is about a mountain, and that is actually written by, again, her husband. Now at this time, everyone look at Naomi. Mary Shelley was Naomi's age when she wrote this. And so we expect you guys to write really seminal work in the next year that will span the test of time. Just kidding. And so a very young age, right? And so Naomi is certainly mature, but she has probably not in her life fully matured her understanding of the ways of the world. She's kind of at this, like all of you are, at this kind of pivoting point of life where you're not a child anymore, but you haven't fully, you've graduated into adulthood in a certain extent, but haven't fully experienced what that looks like. And this will be actually a criticism when people find out that she's so young. Well, first of all, they find out that it was a woman that wrote it because this was not acceptable in that society. And so many people assumed that it was her husband that wrote Frankenstein to begin with, because it has a lot of similar imagery that is used in his poems. And in fact, they kind of allowed that to go on so that the book could get out there. But what a lot of people didn't know at that time, really, or think about Mary Shelley, was that she was actually raised by both a father and a mother who were very, very gifted at writing. In fact, her mom wrote a book that kind of spanned that time, that was really kind of one of the first feminist, like, women need to be empowered, we need to get away from this kind of old line of thinking types of things. And so this happens right around 1818. And so this is, when we want to think about it in terms of us, this is kind of at the really, really young age of America, right? America's just coming on the scene. It's in its infancy still. And so this is what's taking place back then. Again, we need to make sure that we think of things in terms of the times in which they were written, because at that time, right, no internet, we don't have cars, airplanes, all of those sorts of things. And so, like, horse-drawn carriages are still pretty prevalent. If you could explore things, and we'll get into that in just a minute, you came from a position of wealth. And so she was fairly wealthy in that she was able to travel. All right, and so let's talk about the genre. The first part of a genre is that it's considered romantic, sublime. Does anyone want to hazard a guess what that word? I think we know what romantic means. Not in the sense of it's not a love story. So when we think of romantic, we think of something that kind of idealizes the way life should be. And so that would be a romantic form of writing at that time. But what does sublime mean? It's a trickier word. It's not a word we use in our lexicon very often.
Really good.
Yeah, really good. This is the way that one person would define the romantic sublime. That which inspires fear and awe and pity It makes you feel powerless because there is something that has greater power. And I love the way that they formulate that. Again, we live in a culture that has so information inundated. And you live, quite honestly, we live in a very beautiful place. And it's easy to take for granted the beauty that's around us. But imagine going into the national parks and that sort of thing, and seeing some of the, the beauty of nature that we have around us. Can anyone think of like your favorite places to go around here that make you, that when you think about God's creation makes you feel maybe a little bit smaller, that makes you feel like this is amazing? Can we think of those pictures in nature in our own mind? Now, this is what the author is after. In fact, in her book, she talks about a specific place, Mont Blanc, which is what the poem that her husband wrote about. And I'm going to read just a section here to give you a little bit of a flavor for what we mean when we say romantic sublime. You're going to read a lot of that where she's going to start talking about nature and things that are around her. Now, we want to be very clued into this because, again, she's coming from a perspective of this would have been out of the ordinary for most people. Think in terms of most people don't live near mountains. Imagine, if you would, that you never saw a mountain in your life, and then to have something described to you that would have felt very, very big, majestic, sublime. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear. The sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but these were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country. Who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake? Now, this person is fond of this area of their childhood, right? And we can imagine that the setting of a beautiful lake and streams and hills and a mountain that peaks out above all other mountains. And the author here is even saying that, how do you even describe this to somebody who have no frame of reference or mind? And so for her, for Mary Shelley, she would have saw nature as this really romantic ideal, that the whole thought or idea of being out in nature and just peering out at creation. Now, she wouldn't give any authority, certainly, to God, per se. But there's this feeling, this feeling of something bigger, something better, something more grand. And it inspires emotion, different emotion. At time, it can be wonder. At time, it can be fearful, right? Like if you've ever gone to the ocean, you see the waves crashing. We live not too far from Rialto Beach, which that beach is much more violent than a lot of other beaches. And to walk out into it, and you ever walk out a little bit too far into the ocean thinking, this is no big deal, and you kind of get sucked back for a minute and you go, whoa, this is a lot more powerful than I realized. Again, these are the kinds of emotions that authors that speak from the romantic sublime are trying to get at here. And so, as best as you can, and maybe for some of us, being out in nature might be a good place for us to consider it. When we talk about the mountains, imagine in your own mind, in your own heart, the most majestic mountains you've seen. When it talks about a lake, put yourself there. Lake Crescent is something that, is powerful imagery for you. Imagine what that's like, that you're sitting out by Lake Crescent with Storm King hovering above you in the distance. This is what the author is trying to get at. The second form in genre is that it's Gothic. Does anyone know what that word means? this is actually where they get more of the earlier idea of horror. And so Gothic would have been really about wanderers, loners, people who are outcasts from society, and maybe even people who are outcasts from God. Those who are ultimately kind of really struggling with their own conscience. And so they're trying to grapple with these big themes of things like, who am I in this world? What does my life mean? What does life mean? But they're often people that feel ostracized or kind of set out from culture. Now, a way that we might look at this would be, and it's more kind of a bleak, Gothic would be more bleak. One of the ways that we might be able to relate to this is not that life is so bleak, but that we are people that are set apart, right? There's something different about how we operate in life that creates, if we're honest, sometimes maybe some tension between others that don't see things the way we see things, or understand things the way that we understand them, or like things the way that we like, or that we would particularly subscribe our life to. And so we have the romantic sublime, the majestic, the awe-inspiring, and then this theme of particularly people who kind of feel like outliers or rejected, and not just rejected from other men, but ultimately rejected from God. And then lastly, and we see this in the title, Modern Prometheus, is mythological. What does that mean? What is a myth?
Something that isn't true.
Right. Operating in the arena of myth or rules outside of the realm of realism. And so we'll see that the creature is created, right? Using dead body parts. It's reanimated and brought to life. Is that real? Can that happen? No. But what we'll see is that the author will give us a veil of realism in the way that they write. And we'll talk about that a little bit next week. But we've got to understand that we might think of that like, this just seems silly. But at that time, there were things like alchemy and galvanism and these concepts where they believed that you could change certain things, alchemy, like certain metals to become gold, or galvanism where you could strike something with electricity and animate it, bring it to life. And so this was something that was really popular at the time in kind of their understanding of the way life works. There was a lot of conversation around, is it possible to bring something dead back to life? And so for them, as they're reading this might be a little bit more rooted in this, is this possible? And so where it might become more of a horror for the original reader is that they're, again, not as advanced in science and understanding of certain things. And so this kind of deals in this world in which this could be a possibility for us. And this would be a frightful thing, would it not? To imagine something lifeless coming back to life. Now again, at that time, the way that they viewed science was not really favorable. In fact, with anyone who was studying human anatomy, the place that they would go to would be graveyards. There would be grave robbers that would take body parts and stuff like that so they could experiment on them. And so this, again, is in the mindset of those who are reading. And so when we think of horror, we have, again, this mindset of people just like panicked, right? Because this is like a really common experience. Like you would worry at this time, particularly in Europe, where there was a lot more studies happening, that maybe your family member could get stolen from their grave. And so that was a fearful thing, right? And so again, we're looking at it through this backdrop because that gives us a better perspective of what the original reader would have dealt with. They're not dealing with a couple hundred years of time and wisdom and understanding that has taken place since then. And so these are the three primary genres in which we're going to tackle. And I want you to keep them at the back of your mind only because that will lend itself to what you're reading, right? Keeping in mind that this is romantic sublime. And so when they're talking about mountains and it feels a little poetic and you might snicker and say, this is silly, why are we talking about mountains? You want to shift your mind into, no. The author is saying something here. And so I want to get into a frame of reference where I'm seeing that this is supposed to be bigger than life. And what does that mean here in the context of what I'm reading? When I think about Gothic, I want to explore the thoughts of what it must feel like to be alienated or ostracized or shut away or pushed away. And I might have questions, even in this sense, of not just people who are rejecting me, but what would it be like to be rejected by God? What would that feeling be like? Because this is intentional by the author. They're exploring some of these concepts here. But we also must keep in mind that it's mythological, right? And I think this goes without saying. I don't think anyone's going to panic that this might actually happen. But keeping in mind that the mythology is important to the English understanding of literature, because mythology is some of our earliest writings, right? When we look at the earliest writings that we have, certain things are always told in a mythological sense, right? We have a really modern cultural thing that we read or we watch these movies, right? The Lord of the Rings. This is based on a mythology that the author has created for us of another world. The earliest Christian writings that we find that were in story form come from a poem called Beowulf. And Beowulf is written from a mythological Norse or Viking area, and it talks about the battle between good and evil. And so we want to keep that in mind, that there's a mythology here that is intended to be fantastical, to tell us a deeper truth. And so this is where we get hyperbole, or something that's over-exaggerated. All right, and so that leads us here to this quote from Paradise Lost, which, if you ever think about reading Paradise Lost, I definitely would say at your age, have a really clear understanding with your parents and conversation of it, because John Milton, who wrote this, is writing a very particular story of two characters, primarily Adam and Satan. And in both of these characters, he's trying to look at them as being sympathetic creatures. So like poor Adam, that he was created, and he had to contend in a world, and poor Satan, that he was created and he was cast down. Well, again, that's not super helpful for us, because we know why Satan is cast down, right? But he was intentionally trying to take the perspective of what would it be like for us to consider that rejection. And this is one of the probably the most famous quote, and we'll see it in Mary Shelley. She uses this as the backdrop to begin her story. And let me ask you what this means. So as I read it, I want you to be thinking, and maybe a few of you can share your thoughts on this. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Now, what does this mean, do you think?
I could try to tell it in plain language.
What's that?
I could try to tell it in like simpler language.
Yeah, do it simple. Simplify it for us. Perfect.
It's like, did I ask you to make me a man? I used to be a lump of clay. And did I call you from darkness to make me higher?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's kind of like, why me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Perfect way of, why me? Why did you create me? I didn't ask for this. Why did I have to be born? The sad reality is there's a culture right now that is really skewed in this thinking. There's actually a story, this is real, of a person who is suing their parents because she was born. And they never asked her permission to be born. There's a mindset within our culture, even of people saying that you should hire spiritualists to ask this unborn child whether you should have kids. And I know it's something we can snicker at, right? And it seems funny. That's, I think, a perfectly reasonable response. That's the response I have. This is foolishness. And yet, there is this struggle within those people's hearts of trying to figure out, why was I created? Now, again, think of it from this perspective. Those people that ask those questions, that have that mindset, do you think, a higher perspective of what life is? Or do you think that maybe something is triggered in their life that they feel like life is not worth living? And so they feel really robbed. Like, you robbed me. You gave me life. That robbed me of something. Now, again, this is at the backdrop of the story that we're about to read. Because we will see in one man's effort to advance science, to advance knowledge, and to make a name for himself, he brings to life this creature that never, ever asked to be created. And what we'll explore is the story in which we find ourselves with three main characters. The first that will be introduced is a man named Walton. And ultimately, his character is significant to us only in that he's kind of the primary narrator of the story. He's the one recounting things that have happened. But inside of that story is the story of Victor. And so we see the biggest picture is the story is being told by a man named Walton. But at a certain time, Walton is relaying to us the story as told by Victor Frankenstein. Who at a certain point, when Victor is telling the story to Walton, Victor is giving way to the perspective of, we'll just say the monster or the creature. And so this is what is called in literary circles a story within a story, but it's more specifically called an embedded narrative. We have 3 different perspectives. The ultimate story is told by Walton. So as we read this book, this week we're going to read 4 letters that Walton writes to his sister. And the purpose of these letters is to give us the backdrop or perspective and to bring us into the greater story. And what this does is it lends itself to making it feel like it's a more legitimate thing. Like you're listening in on somebody else's letters, actual letter, right? So if you picked up a letter today from like your grandparents and you read it, you would assume what? That everything in there was true. And so it's trying to draw you in. But inside the context of Walton's narration, we're going to get to a point in time where the perspective shifts to Victor. And now it sounds like Victor is the one talking. Victor is the one who's having an experience. And in the context of that, Victor's going to actually tell a story about when he talked to the monster. And then the monster relayed to him. So the monster told Victor, and Victor told Walton, and Walton tells us. And so we're going to experience the monster or the creature, their experience within the context of life and how they grew up. And so we're going to see a lot of really dynamic shifts in emotion, right? And we want to make note of, as you go through, what do you feel about Walton? What do you think about him? Is he likable, not likable? Do you relate to him? Do you not relate to him? Is he a sympathetic character? Is he an arrogant person? What is his personality like? Then we're going to run into Victor Frankenstein. We're going to have to ask those same questions. Who is he? What's he like? What do I think of him? And we have to leave room for those things to change. Does he get better in my sight? Does he get worse in my sight? Does he change at all? And then we're going to have to take a look certainly at the monster. Once the monster is created and how that creature's life goes and how they speak and what they understand. And we're going to have to ask ourselves the same question. Ultimately, the last thing that we're going to do, the last course of this class, will be to answer this question. Who is the monster? Who is the monster? And that's a question that we're going to try to figure out. We're going to try to flesh it out. And I promise you this, it shouldn't be an easy answer, because there should be a lot of reasons why we conclude what we conclude. And so ultimately, we're then left really clearly with kind of this outline of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, who is going to explore for us, what does it mean to be created? What does life's purpose really mean? What does it mean to be in relationship? Now, Mary Shelley did not lead a pure and perfect life. The man that she would eventually marry, Percy, was actually already married. And when they met, she was very young. And she got caught up with him. And so this man left his wife to be with her. Now, she had experienced a lot of death in her life. In fact, her mom died in childbirth, giving birth to her. And so this probably framed out her thinking pretty early in life. She would actually get some of the story of this would be that she would lose her own child with Percy. She lost multiple children, but one child in particular. And she imagined one night in a dream just like warming the kid up by the fire. And if we could just add warmth, that maybe that life would return. And so she's asking herself the very same questions that she's trying to answer in this book. What is life like? How is it fair that some live and some die? How is it fair that I'm here and that I'm experiencing these things? And I never invited myself into it. I didn't feel like I have a choice in it. And life kind of happened to me. And all this difficulty has taken place within my life. But again, she sets out to tell a haunting story. The criticisms that she would receive from this book would be oftentimes kind of comical, because people would say, well, there's no real moral to this story. There's nothing really of value in here. You shouldn't read it. It's terrible writing. And a lot of that resistance was because of the circles in which she traveled were people that others wanted to alienate and judge. And so a great deal of people at the time when it was written tore the book apart. Now, obviously, we're talking about a couple hundred years later. So has it stood the test of time? Yeah. It is considered to be the first truly kind of science fictional categorical book, kind of fantasy world. It generated more popularity around this kind of writing. That was true as well of people like Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, some other things like that at that time that again were very like gothic and darker. But again, all of these books were not written with the purpose of just trying to scare you. And that's the modern understanding. These books were written to try to make you think about kind of the supernatural or things beyond our own understanding. This book, if we read it properly, should force us to maybe consider, what if this is a question we asked of God? And it seems, I'll be honest, at first it can seem kind of blasphemous, like how dare we ask God? But I think if we come from the right understanding here, the right perspective, and the right heart, right? We're not saying, God, why did you make me? But in one sense, we could ask God, well, God, what did you make me for? What was the purpose in creating me? What are your thoughts towards me? Well, the Bible says that really clearly. What are his thoughts towards us? They good thoughts? Bad thoughts? What does the Father think about us? What does the Father think about us when we err and we make mistakes? What does the Father think about us when we succeed and we do really well? Does his love shift based on what we do? Does his heart for us only for those who are really, really, really obedient? Is God grieved by the things that we say and do? Again, I want to encourage you guys to explore some of these thoughts and concepts. And I want you to be invited into the book, not as a lesson in trying to learn necessarily specific things that are laid out for you. I want to invite you into reading this book really with an ear open to the Spirit of God, trying to prod you and nudge you. And so if you find yourself reading, and I hope you do, and you get to a place where you go, I wonder what that means. I wonder what they're thinking or feeling. I want to invite you to pause there and to take some time to journal it, either in your books or in your journals, but to really kind of flesh it out. Again, the thought behind this is that we enter into the story, that we're not some mere observers sitting 200 years away and looking back in time, but we want to put ourselves in the position of each of the characters that we will run across. And obviously we're not just running across these three characters. There's a bunch of other side characters that we'll get to know and experience. And again, we want to ask ourselves what we think about them. What do we feel? Maybe even ask ourselves, what is the purpose of them being placed in the book? Because again, everything is done with intention. Whether the author knew it or not, it was intentional and purposeful. There is something there that we are meant to learn from. And my hope is for each of us that maybe we'll come to some different understandings, some different perspectives, and we might be challenged in different ways. And so even though we will have class time built in for something like this, and hopefully not as long, where there's a time for, lack of a better term, a lecture, where I'm sharing kind of the insights that I'm hoping to help flesh things out, that there's time built in for you guys to discuss things that have stood out to you. And it might be a quote from the book, or it might remind you of something else. I want to invite you guys into this being a class where you guys are leading one another towards your own insights and thoughts. My hope is that we can piggyback off of one another. And so even as I'm asking questions up here, my hope is that I'm not asking questions to try to get you always to the right answer, the answer that Justin says, or that Justin thinks. I'm trying to get us at this is what you all think. But asking yourself, how did you arrive there? What were the thoughts that were going on? So again, this can be a discussion, a dialogue. Because I believe at the heart of this book, when it's all said and done, that if we allow it to, it can change us in a really, really good way. And that's not true of most people in the secular world that read this. They read it for entertainment. I have no interest in submitting this to you merely for your entertainment. I hope you're entertained by it. I hope you enjoy the book. Some of you don't, that's fine. Not everyone has to love the same things. I would also ask that as you read it, right, you guys have probably read multiple books in your life, but we've read one for sure, right, with Dickens. We ask ourselves, do I like this book better than I liked Great Expectations? Not as much? Is it about the same? And ask ourselves why. What makes you appealed to it or not? As we read through the book, maybe even you chart it out like, this week's reading was a -3, but then the next week, like, this one, man, this really stood out. We might even do that in our books. Highlight the chapters and circle it and star, asterisk. Like, I'm going to come back to that chapter. That chapter was, and I would even invite you in the multiple chapters to pick maybe three chapters that you're like, if somebody was going to read Frankenstein and just read excerpts, man, I would pick those 3. That would be my recommendation to them. And again, considering why, what is it about that? Because again, the purpose of us reading these books is to be drawn into human experience, our own understanding, wrestling with deeper things. And ultimately, I believe that there's a lot that can be said here for what the Spirit wants to teach us. Because as we ask or we reflect on this, did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? I think we all know the answer to that is none of us did. None of us asked to be here. And yet God selected you to be here in this moment right now, to be in the families that you are a part of, to be whatever, firstborn, secondborn, first son born, only son born, multiple brothers, only one sister, right? How we fit, middle child, and how we relate then to the world around us changes. Does it not? Benji, your perspective in your household will be different than Emma's. But male, female, oldest, right smack in the middle, right? And those are different experiences. She has the benefit of observing from your successes and your failures, right? You didn't have anyone to go before you. You were the first, right? And I would trust, I know this is true of my parenting with Kayla. I made more mistakes with Kayla than I did with any other kid. Why? Because she was brand new. I had some really tremendous successes in raising her. It gets, hopefully, little Cammy, he gets the benefit if I'm mature, right? Of all of the lessons learned. But that doesn't mean that when Caden came along, second child, that we treated him the same, because second child problems are different than first child problems, right? How many of you are exactly the same as all of your siblings? You guys are just all spitting images. How many of you can tell the differences between, right? How many of you in your family, you have a loud one? When I say the loud one, your mind went right to who the loud one was. How many of you in your family have the quiet one? How many of you in the family have the bossy one? How many of you have the one who's really resistant to being bossed? Right? So we can label this out, right? We have these experiences. Now, again, let me just caution that doesn't, just because we have this experience or this thought, doesn't make it true. Because I could ask a sibling, well, who's the bossy one? And the fingers will get pointed, It's not me, it's them. All right, and so it's important. I'm only bringing that up because I want to say this, that each of you distinctly has a perspective on what we're going to read. And each of your perspectives are just as vital and important as everyone else. And that includes the one who's teaching you. My opinion of Frankenstein, I'm not the expert here who's like, think what I think, know what I know, feel what I feel. You have to arrive at this. No, the invitation here is for each of us to become experts in our experiences with this book. So that as we discuss, as we wrestle with, as we talk about, we might arrive at some understandings where we can collectively, right, as a community, grow and learn from it. At the end of Frankenstein, hopefully what this has done for us is it's brought us a little closer together because it's something that we've shared experientially and we have wrestled with. And so I really want to press you guys in this. I know I say this all the time, but I want to invite you into conversation. But let's make sure that conversation is rooted not in I'm trying to prove myself. There's nothing to prove here. Let's let it be a genuine thing. If you guys are struggling or you just don't get it, let that be a genuine thing. And you can raise your hand and say, you know what, I didn't really get anything out of it this week. This week was boring. That's okay. And let's be honest about that. But at the same time, then let's be opened up to maybe somebody else thought that was the best chapter. I want to find out why. I want to be a little bit curious as to why this week, maybe for Isaac, it was just like, meh. But for Esther, it was like, that was really life-changing. If I were Isaac in that situation, I'd really want to try to learn from Esther what her experience was and why it was profound. It doesn't mean that I'm going to shift my perspective, but what it does is, it offers insight into community understanding. In fact, the way that they rank, books nowadays is kind of based on all of the different commentaries on it. Who generally thinks that this is a pretty good book? And again, this is where we may differ. This is considered widely to be one of the top 50 books in the history of books, of literature to be written. So that says something, right? It says that for 200 plus years, people have looked on it favorably. Doesn't mean we have to. But what is the essence? What is the Father trying to get us to understand? As individuals, yes. But as a corporate group that gathers together each Monday, what are the things that the Lord wants us to wrestle with? And I'll leave it here today again with this question, is ultimately looking at this, and I think this quote would be a good way to frame it for us as well and consider. But what is it that you need in life? What are the absolutes? You have to have them in life. And you can answer that in practical ways. You can answer that in more kind of like hard to define, but this is just experiential. This is just for me. This is like, and again, as we flesh this out and as we talk about it, let's make sure that we are curious about what makes other people tick. Because I know for some people, things like, man, if there wasn't art to look at, I don't think I could live without it. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how, life without books, and I'm using like silly examples. I can't imagine life without reading a book. I can't imagine a world in which that to me, books to me feel a lot of times like a need. Now, I have to keep that in proper perspective, but again, I want us to think about those things and wrestle with them. And make sure, though, that as we're discussing it, that somebody else's need, something that they feel like really validates their existence, that we're not flippant about it and we don't undermine it. Right? Because the things that you guys like don't have to be the things that I like. The things that I desire don't have to be the things you desire. Not at the start, anyways. But ultimately, what are we trying to be taught that there is a perspective that we absolutely need to rally around, right? And that ultimately is that my wants, my thinking, my feelings, my soul is submitted to a spirit, something that is greater than me, that informs my life, that gives me life, that requests me, that solicits me to be in this very room at this very time for a very particular reason. Miles Monroe, the pastor, he said this: your existence, the fact that you draw breath, is evidence, it's proof that this generation can include old, young, all in between, that this generation needs something that your life contains. The fact that you guys are here and breathing oxygen means that everyone else in this room has a need of your life and the lessons in your life. We need each other. We belong to each other. The concept of community is extremely important for us to grasp. I think Frankenstein will do a good job of helping us flesh out some of those topics. And so this week, for you, we are going to be reading letters 1 through 4. So, at least in my book, and hopefully we have roughly the same page numbers, page 15 through 32. So, roughly 17 pages. A couple pages a day, easy peasy, no problem. And then we'll gather again next week. So let's pause here.